So we had a big row. Then I'm sure we didn't prevail. I can't remember what happened, but that sent us over to the, Hicks was there, of course. It sent us over to the meetings that they began having. I can't even remember where we had them, because we didn't have the Carpenter's Hall then. But we'd go to the meetings, and we learned that we better be precinct delegates, and what precinct delegates were all about. I didn't really have a notion of it. It just sounded like awfully hard work to me. So we became precinct delegates, and we, in the middle of all this, when we were getting very close to a meeting, I think it was Jim Hare who came up with a story to us that petitions were for precinct delegate were being passed around in houses and different places, and people were sitting down at tables. They bring pens and they'd sit down at tables and write oh, what do you call it?
It's called a round robin.
Well,
they
yeah,
would
but
sign other people's names.
Different people, yeah, they'd be given, it would be in an area like Grosse Pointe or someplace. And then they'd fill out these petitions, and everybody was taking a hand at it. Some of the people just sat down and with one handwriting wrote them all. Well, I'm sure it was Jim Hare who caught on to what was going on, and Jim was livid. And anybody who ever knew Jim knew that if he got on something, he stayed with it. He finally became secretary, the Secretary of State under Menon Williams. But he battled. We were all very upset about it, because they had more delegates petitions than we did by a long shot, because we'd all done our own. They had gone out and gotten them signed. And it was taken into court finally. And the court accepted it. And they declared that we were the winners, that the people who had properly designated ballots were the people who would decide who would be the precinct delegates. They had to have a properly signed ballot before, well, it was. And so we won that fight, except that they weren't willing to accept that we'd fight it. And I remember the first meeting that a meeting that we had that was going to decide it. And there were three of us who were Al Myers. No, there were four of us. No, it was three men, the two men and myself. First, Al Myers and Barney
Taylor.
Barney Taylor, whose wife was a prize package too, and Barney Taylor, who were to make the decisions. And we sat in a straight line, and right in back of us was a stairway that went down into the basement of the Carpenter's Hall. That Carpenter's Hall was a beautiful hall. It was great. And all of a sudden we found out that the whole street was full of policemen, and there was this business of the people shoving their way up to get in the lines, and they were coming in with they'd had the election, and they were coming in with these ballots and whatnot, and we had made up our minds that anybody, the court had said this, and we made up our minds that we were abiding by it, of course, that anybody who had a properly signed application and had won seat a precinct delegate, we would accept. Didn't make a difference whether they were on our side or somebody else's side. They started coming in. We finally decided that they'd have to stand on the line outside, and we had people out there telling people, when they could tell for themselves that the ballots weren't proper, that they couldn't come in if they had the proper election as precinct delegate. They could come in, and we would sign them up. They came in, and we looked at them, and we accepted one after another. That was perfectly all right. In the meantime, it got noisier outside, and they began to fight outside. They began having real fights. And finally, we finished. We had done all we could. We didn't let anybody else in because it was getting too rough. It was very bad. And the police were there and all. So then somebody came in and tried to grab the ballots. And Al Myers, you know, who was as thin as the rail, jumped up. And with that, the table turned over. And I fell backward. And if it had not been for someone of the UAW men who stood at the head of the stairway, I'd have been going yet down that stairway backward. It was a very difficult meeting. Then, do you remember the federal government sent in committees? The federal government was pretty Republican at the time, and it sent in committees, and they sent for us to hear. And I remember going in. I had to go down to the federal building, and they were to hear me and find out whether I was a regular delegate or not. And when they got through asking me the questions, and I told them that I had gone to the convent down at Monroe, and I told them that I graduated from Marygrove College, and a few things, they decided they would let me. I didn't have to prove anymore that I was a delegate. But some people were turned away. But we didn't fool with that. We were very, very careful about it. But the next day, the papers, of course, came out with this blood on the pavement story. Yeah. And it was really very hard to go back into a social situation and answer for this, because who's going to believe anything like that of a political party?
You remember? All right, now, Adelaide, as I remember, we were saying in the break there was Al Myers and you. The table was dumped over. You were falling back, and then Barney Taylor. Barney was a veteran that had
No, it wasn't Barney. It was somebody who was back of me.
Oh, I think it's Johnny Tooter or somebody.
Somebody on the stairway.
That's right. Barney Taylor was on the committee with you.
Yeah, and he had to be a pretty big fellow to pick me up.
Now, do you remember some of the other people you worked with to be precinct delegates?
Well, boy, I worked with so many to pick anybody out.
Was Mary and Horace Gilmore were active?
Oh yeah, well, we used to take turns, and Sid Woolner.
Yeah, Sid
We used
Woolner.
to take turns. They would come, and we would go out together. Sid and I would be on would be across the street, and Mary and Horace on the other side.
Yeah.
And we would go from place to place. And what I determined to do was make a list of Democrats, a list of Republicans, and a list of independents. Then I would decide what to do about them when I got home. Yeah. And that was a very successful way of working, because I really found out the people who were going to be glad to see me. And I was very close to my neighbors around there, and I wanted to remain close to them. I wanted to be friends. But I remember one time Horace Gilmore meeting me in the middle of the road. He signaled to me to come to the middle of the road, and he was just hysterical. He was laughing until he just shook. He had gone to one house and he had asked them if they had known Hicks Griffith. Oh, the man said, yes, and everything I know about him is good. And of course, there had been nothing good printed in the paper about Hicks Griffith